Well, good evening again, and we're going to continue our studies in the book of Daniel. Tonight we'll be covering Daniel chapter 5 and probably chapter 6. Remember from last week we had chapters 3 and 4, and then we remember in chapters 3, let's see, no, I have my wrong notes here, but who remembers what happened in chapter 3? We had what? Meshach.
They were going into the furnace because they didn't bow down to the king.
King Nebuchadnezzar, that's right. That's right. And then what happened in chapter 4? He kind of had a turning around, the king did, and he, I kind of called it a conversion, he realized who God was, and that the gods of Meshach and Abednego, and that he was indeed a God. Their God was the one who should be praised, although he didn't say not to worship the other gods, but he said their gods should be worshipped. But in Daniel chapter 5, starts out with King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. So now Belshazzar was the last king of the Babylon, last of the kings of Babylon. And he was the son of Nabonidus by Nitocris, and Nitocris, who was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And so that made him actually his grandson. It made Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And back in that time, there wasn't really a word for grandson, and so it was Belshazzar, son of Nebuchadnezzar. But anyway, so this was King Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, and some translations say heated with wine, so in other words, he was drunk, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, which would have actually been his grandfather, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. And this was when Babylon had been captured, when Babylon had captured Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and concubines, drank from them. And as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold, silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So notice who they praised. They praised the gods of the gold, the gods of the silver, the gods of the stone, of the bronze. They were not praising God, and they had taken the treasures from what had been sanctified to God, and they started drinking out of them. And suddenly, in verse 2, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. And the king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. So that's kind of graphic description there of what's going on. He turned pale. His thoughts began to trouble him. And why do you think that was? Because he had taken the vessels that had been sanctified for use in the temple for the use of the Lord only. He had profaned them not only by drinking from them, but he began to praise the gods of God, gold and silver. And in Isaiah chapter 21, this is actually prophesied, in which verse 2, Isaiah declares, "A dire vision has been shown to me. The traitor betrays, the looter takes. Elam attack, Media lay siege. I will bring an end all the groaning she caused. At this my body is racked with pain. Pain seized me like those of a woman in labor. I am staggered by what I hear. I am bewildered by what I see. My heart falters. Fear makes me tremble. The twilight I long for has become a horror to me. They set the tables, they spread the rugs, they eat, they drink. Get up, you officers, oil the shields. This is what the Lord says to me. Go post a lookout and have him report what he sees. And when he sees chariots with teams of horses, riders on donkeys or riders on camels, let him be alert, fully alert. And the lookout shouted, day after day, my Lord, I stand on the watchtower. Every night I stay at my post. Look, here comes a man in a chariot with a team of horses. And he gives back the answer. Babylon has fallen. It has fallen. All the images of its gods lie shattered on the ground. My people who are crushed on the threshing floor, I tell you what I have heard from the Lord Almighty, from the God of Israel. So Isaiah is prophesying here against Babylon and speaking of the fall of Babylon. And it surely seems to describe a couple of hundred years before the very thing of which Daniel now describes this. And of course, this is the night that Babylon fell, which we're going to read. And Cyrus, the Persian king, the Medo-Persian king, came in and they conquered Babylon. And that brings up another interesting prophecy that Isaiah wrote about as he was prophesying about the destruction of Babylon, in which he named Cyrus. In chapter 44 of Isaiah, verse 28, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid. And then continuing in chapter 45 through verse 7, this is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him, and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you and will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. I will give you hidden treasures, riches stored in secret places, so you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, who summons you by name. For the sake of Jacob my servant, of Israel my chosen, I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, for there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me, so that from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, people may know that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. So this is 200 years in advance that he's saying, I will loose the loins of the kings to open the gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I'll go before thee, make the places straight. And he said that you may know that I am the Lord, which called thee by name, that I am the God of Israel for Jacob, my servant's sake. I then call thee by name and surname thee. So Isaiah wrote this about the year 712 BC. And what we're reading here in Daniel is about 538 BC. So 150 years or so before the event, God in Isaiah speaks about it, and he talks about loosening the loins of the kings and opening up the levied gates. The city of Babylon was thought to be impregnable, and it had a wall some 300 feet high, and earlier on we studied this. It had a wall some 300 feet high, 80 feet thick, with massive towers on it, and then it had a secondary wall, not quite as large, and the Euphrates River flowed through the middle of the city of Babylon. The wall was 15 miles around the city. It was lined off with blocks going east and west, or streets, and they were wide streets going east and west, north and south, and the streets intersected where the Euphrates River was, and they had bridges. They also had gates that they could shut so the Euphrates River could be sealed off, and the city could actually be divided into two by sealing off. Yes? Present-day Iraq.
Iraq.
Yes.
Okay, I was thinking Iran, but it's Iraq.
Yeah. According to the historians back then, the night that Babylon fell, that we're reading about in chapter 5, they say that it happened because the soldiers were drunk. Remember, you threw a party for thousands, and they were too drunk to know what they were doing. They unlocked the gates to the levee that came from they did not lock the gates that came from the Euphrates River. And so Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persian army, diverted or had built diversion channels for the river Euphrates. So when the river was diverted, then Cyrus and his soldiers were able to come in under the wall through the riverbed that usually flowed into the middle. And since they were able to divert that water, then they were able to come up into the city. And they found the gates unlocked, and so then they took the city. And once again, the soldiers were probably too drunk to defend it. And so, as it was prophesied by Daniel in great detail, even naming the king that God would use to destroy the Babylon, and then it gets fulfilled. But fear, as we were talking about, fear came upon Belshazzar when he saw the hand of God. And, lots of times we ourselves, or there are people who seem to be very forward or very forward in their mockery or their ridicule of God. And it seems that they have no fear of God whatsoever. And, they're just brazen. And we see this in today's world where people are just not afraid to have blasphemy towards God. And which, is very disturbing, and it bothers me. It just turns me off when I see individuals that do this. But here, Belshazzar, in his party, he was drinking wine out of the vessels as he praised the gods of silver and gold. But then he saw the hand of God, and he was the king who was very blasphemous and very brazen towards his against God. All of a sudden saw the hand of God, and he began to shake. And we've probably all seen people who were brazen in their blasphemy, but once God begins to get a hold of them, we see them wither like a leaf, so to speak. People like to talk tough, but no man can stand against God. And so Belshazzar began to shake. His thoughts troubled him. So the king summoned the enchanters, the astrologers, and the diviners, starting in verse 7. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." So now, remember that King Nebuchadnezzar was the first, he was the second, and so now Belshazzar is offering the position of the third ruler of Babylon to whoever can interpret this dream. So then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. But the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of your gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. And so call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." And then Daniel answered the king. He said, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." So Daniel wasn't going to prostitute the gifts that God had given him, the works that God had given him. And so that's why he says, keep your gifts, give them to someone else. I don't want them, I don't need them. I'll tell you what it says, I'll interpret it for you. But before he interprets it, Daniel has some words that he wants to give the king. And Daniel, at this point in Daniel's life, has to be about 90 years old, because we remember when we started just back in chapter 1 that when he was taken into Babylon, he was taken into Babylon as a teenager, maybe late teens, when he was taken captive. And so he's been in there approximately 70 years now at this point here. And so that makes him right around 90 years old. And so, you know, with age becomes a passage of right. You kind of get to say what you want. And so this is, so Daniel takes this opportunity to preach a stern message to the king. And he says, "Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. And because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. And those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled." So that was the absolute authority that Nebuchadnezzar possessed. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. So Belshazzar was well aware of all of this that had gone on with Nebuchadnezzar and the madness that Nebuchadnezzar had experienced over his 7 seasons that had passed over him. And he was aware of his restoration proclamation that he had made when he said that there was no God in all the earth like the God of Daniel. And so Belshazzar knew of all of this. And so Daniel is reminding him that you are sinning against the knowledge that you have. And so you should actually know better. But instead, as we continue in verse 23, instead you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. So Daniel is saying, this is what your sin is. And he was praising the gods of wood, stone, brass, and silver, the gods that they had made with their own hands, even though their gods couldn't see, their gods couldn't hear, their gods knew nothing. And yet they were praising them and blaspheming God, in whose hand God, the life was, whose hand that Belshazzar's breath was in. And, and that's kind of not to go on a little rabbit hunt, but that's kind of an interesting fact. That the his life is in God's hand. And if you take, because some translations say the God whose hand is thy very breath, that thy very breath is in. And, your lungs, our lungs, are an involuntary muscle. They're not attached to our skeleton, and you do not have to think to breathe, and it's something that's done automatically. And there are a few people that unfortunately in life are afflicted with rare disease, and they have to think to breathe. But in general, it's our breath is involuntary. We don't have to think about it. And we can be thankful that we don't have to be on any sort of machine that breathes for us, or have to think to breathe like some people do. And God also controls the heart. He controls the heartbeat. We don't have to tell our heart to beat. He has that life. He has that breath. It doesn't take our mind to control them. And it's done automatically for us. The lungs work that way. The kidneys work that way. Those things that life depends upon, that God doesn't leave with something else. He doesn't leave with us to take care of that. God takes care of that. So, one translation, the God in whose hand your very breath is in. So, therefore, continuing on, therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Now, this is Daniel, of course, telling him what it means. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So this is a very definitive declaration from God. He's telling him, your kingdom is numbered, it's finished, you've been weighed in the balances and you've come up short. Your kingdom is going to be taken away from you and divided between the Medes and the Persians. So then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So in chapter 6, in chapter 6, we continue on. So it pleased Darius, the new king, who took over the kingdom, to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom. So the Persian Medo Empire had conquered the Babylonian Empire, and Darius was co-reigning with Cyrus. They set over the kingdom 120 satraps. Now remember, satraps were officials that were appointed by King Nebuchadnezzar and were the chief representatives of the king, and most likely had charge of various provinces within the kingdom. And there were other officials in Babylon that we studied in chapter 3 that were the prefects, or the military commanders, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, and the magistrates. So there was three, continuing on in verse 2, with three administrators of them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. So Daniel immediately moved into a position of very high authority with the Medo-Persian Empire, being made one of the three administrators. in verses 3, now Daniel so distinguished himself among its administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So here, because the king wants to elevate him to be over the whole kingdom, you have the other administrators that are jealous. They don't want this to happen, and so therefore they're saying we've got to find a way to get rid of this dude. And
Jesus and the Pharisees.
yeah, exactly. They wanted to get rid of him as well. And so, you know, they're just saying that this guy's too good. We're never going to be able to get him. We're never going to be able to trip him up unless it is with the law of his God. So, continuing in verse 6, so these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. So now, I personally think that that would be a very stupid proclamation to make. So what they're saying is no one can ask anybody for anything for 30 days except of me, the king. And so they were, of course, playing up to his ego, his pride, his flattery. You know, you're so great, you're everything, and but the people need to know how great you are. And so throughout the entire kingdom, no one can pray to any god or ask anybody for anything except to you, so that they'll know how great you are and all. And you know, I personally like to empower people in the office, in my office, to be able to answer questions that take care of customers or take care of clients, so that I can work on all things, but not here. The king is saying, or they're wanting the king to say, everything runs through you, king. Andy, you have a comment?
Were rulers back then similar to rulers today, even in this country, unduly influenced by those that they surround themselves with,
Yep.
oftentimes to their detriment?
Yep, that's right. The rise and fall. So, in verse 8, now your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. So they've made this proclamation. They got it all ready. They brought it to him. Now sign it and seal it and deliver it. And so once this has been signed, the decree has been signed, it cannot be changed, even by Darius the king. And if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar was absolute. Nebuchadnezzar, he could do anything. He had complete control. He could say who lived. He could say who died. He had absolute control. All he had to do was do a decree, and he would do it. But in the Persian Empire, once something is signed, it cannot be changed, even by the king. So in verse 10, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. And then these wise men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. Now, going back over to when we studied 2 Chronicles, remember that Solomon had dedicated the temple that he had built to the Lord. And Solomon prayed a prayer at the dedication of the temple. And in part of that prayer, Solomon said, O Lord, if these people turn their back against thee, and they begin to worship and serve other gods, and they be taken captive by their enemies, if they shall turn toward this place and pray unto thee, then hear thou from thy holy place in heaven, and answer their prayer, and deliver them from captivity. And we remember that God responded to this prayer of Solomon by saying, if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and heal their nation. That's in 2 Chronicles 7:14. Kind of sounds like a prayer we ought to be praying today. And that's one reason why the Jews of today, they go to the Western Wall to pray. We've all seen people on TV when they have the wall that they all go pray to. And that's because on the Western Wall, on the west side of that the Holy of Holies, Solomon's temple once stood. So they're praying towards that place. And so Daniel, turning towards Jerusalem 3 times a day during this 70 years that Daniel was captive in Babylon, it was his custom to turn and pray unto God for the people and for the nation. And he was a great man. I really admire Daniel, the courage of the man, knowing that the king had signed this decree. It's kind of like, no le hace, I'm going to go pray anyway. And he went, as his was custom, left his windows open. It didn't bother him to hide anything. He wasn't going to hide the fact that he was praying to God. And I think about sometimes when we go to eat at a restaurant, do we not pray because we're afraid to be seen praying? So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. So here the king is comforting Daniel, and he's saying, now Daniel, don't worry. I've got to do this, and I've got to do it. He was a fool for signing that kind of edict. But the king says, I know the God that you serve, he's going to deliver you. And this kind of sounds like what we studied last week with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember, they said, the God that we serve, he is able to deliver us from your burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand. And if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow. And this was Daniel's attitude. He was still going to pray. So, continuing on in verse 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. And the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating, without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? So he was kind of half hoping and half wondering what went on, what's behind the stone. So the king had some faith, or he never would have gone over there. And he cried unto Daniel, is your God able to deliver you? Is he able to save you from the lions? And Daniel answered him, and he said, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So, quite a story of faith for Daniel and the king realizing that Daniel's God, our God, is to be worshipped. So let's kind of summarize with the last few minutes. Back into Daniel chapter 5, King Belshazzar has a big feast. He uses the gold and silver vessels that was taken from Jerusalem, and then he worshipped the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And then we have a mysterious hand that appears and writes a message on the palace wall, which terrified him. Nobody could decipher the writings, so the queen reminds the king that Daniel is in the audience, so to speak, and had interpreted dreams for Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel interpreted the dream, which reads, "Mene, mene, tekel, parsin," meaning God has numbered Belshazzar's kingdom and ended it, weighed him and found him wanting, and that his kingdom would be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And then that very night, Belshazzar is slain, and Darius the Mede takes over the kingdom. So, out of Daniel chapter 5, we have a few applications that we can apply to our own lives. One, pride leads to downfall. Belshazzar's arrogance and disrespect for sacred items led to his demise, teaching the danger of pride. We need to learn to respect sacred things. The misuse of sacred items from the temple shows the importance of respecting what is holy. The importance of humility. Unlike his predecessor, Belshazzar didn't acknowledge God's sovereignty, highlighting the need for humility. God is sovereign over his kingdoms. The swift end of Belshazzar's reign demonstrates God's control over the rise and fall of kingdoms. He is in control. And to seek wise counsel, Belshazzar's failure to understand the writing and Daniel's ability to interpret it shows the importance of seeking wisdom from those who are truly knowledgeable. In chapter 6, Daniel is distinguished above other administrators because of his exceptional qualities, and King Darius plans to set him over the entire kingdom. But there is a conspiracy against Daniel where the jealous officials, other administrators, conspire to create a law that forbids prayer to any god or man except the king. But Daniel continues to pray and defy the decree. Daniel's caught, and despite King Darius's distress about it all, is thrown into a den of lions, as the law cannot be repealed. But Daniel was protected by God. He was saved by God, who shut the lion's mouth, and King Darius is overjoyed. But the conspirators were punished, and Darius issues a decree that people must fear and the reverence of God, the God of Daniel. So, some lessons from chapter 6. We have to have integrity under pressure. And Daniel's unwavering commitment to God in the face of adversity serves as a model for maintaining integrity under pressure. We have to trust in God's protection. Daniel's faith in God's protection, even in a seamlessly hopeless situation, encourages trusting in God's care. And Daniel's righteous life influenced a pagan king demonstrating how living a godly life can impact others. We're examples to others. He stood firm in the faith. Daniel's refusal to compromise his worship of God encourages all of us to stand firm in our faith, regardless of the societal pressures that we might have. And God honors faithfulness. Daniel's deliverance from the lion's den illustrates that God honors and protects those who are faithful to him. So, Andy?
You mentioned praying in a restaurant. About 40 years ago, I was in a restaurant in Waco, Texas with a coworker, strong Baptist, and we had a habit before we ate our meals, same restaurant, we would always pray. We would take turns. And one time, this little waitress that had been taking our order came back over and said, "It's good to see two grown men praying before they eat." So, as Daniel set a good example for the king there, we too, even though sometimes we may feel challenged, if we go ahead and do what we know is the right thing, same way Daniel did, it'll point others towards God.
Yeah, that's right. All right, let's close in prayer. Our Father in heaven, once again, we thank thee for this day, and we thank thee for